Janine Co, welcome to the work item. So excited to have you here on the show. It was a very serendipitous discovery. Somebody retweeted one of your tweets about your product management journey, and I thought that I'd reach out and it would be awesome to have you on the show. And it is awesome to have you on the show. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Dan. Really excited to be chatting about my journey into product and how I pivoted from basically like wanting to become a doctor to a product manager.
And this is actually, you're getting right to my next question, which I was going to ask is you actually had a very fascinating journey and something that is not very typical in the product management space and the engineering space. And that is you went to med school and then you decided, you know what? Actually, I'll do product management. Tell me more how the decision came about.
Well, yeah, first of all, I didn't attend med school, so I graduated with a degree in biology thinking I wanted to become a doctor. So that was sort of like my traditional, like my plan. So my original plan was really to pursue an MD PhD because I thought, becoming a physician scientist was a legitimate career. And I really loved research, like, don't get me wrong. And that's why I wanted to become a physician scientist. And I grew up in a very traditional, like, Asian household, but thankfully my parents never pressured me in pursuing the med school route. It was sort of just me, like, I decided to put myself in that situation because I'm a first generation immigrant. I'm also the eldest in my family. And so I had to set myself as an example to my siblings. I thought that pursuing this traditional route, it would ultimately gain the approval of my parents and my family members because that's what Asian households typically do, like compare kids. And at that time, my definition of success was having a doctor title in front of my name. So I think when you're in high school, it's really easy to say you want to become a doctor without even thinking about the consequences later on in life, such as missing the best 2 decades of your life, which is your 20s, missing important life events because you have to study so much and you have clinical duties coming up. You have to deal with heartbreaking events, such as people dying right in front of you. And I think my piece of advice to folks who are pursuing medicine is pursue medicine only when you're ready to serve others, not because you're in it for the money or the prestige, because I don't think you'll make it till the end, well, at least for my case.
Is it really 2 decades? This is, to me, when we talk about the product management career and people jump around so quickly, right? Or you talk about any tech company and hear this other track where you're spending so much time and you're kind of after that, more or less, I want to say like locked into that career track, right? It's not as easy to switch to something else.
Because I was really fortunate that I got to work with different people, like graduate students, professors, and I got to see how they were able to build their careers. And to me, there's actually three things that just stood out to me. Was it's just really slow in science in the healthcare industry per se. There's little people interaction. Like you typically just network with folks if you're working in the same building, and that was it. And the third one being the work is just so repetitive. Like every time, I come to the lab at 8 a.m. in the morning, I leave home around like 7 to like 8 per se. And then once I get home, it's like my work still isn't over yet. Like I still have to read up so many research papers and do this and that. So I just thought that that sort of life or that kind of life just wasn't for me. And that's why I decided to pivot, from being in the med school like route, like pursuing medicine in the long term to something else. And that's something else at that time. I had no idea what I wanted to do.
Was there a pivotal moment in that regard where you just kind of thought, okay, this is it. This is where I switch, or was it more gradual?
To be honest, I think at that time, after graduation, I was just completely lost. So 2 months after graduation, I was applying to so many jobs. Like I was literally so desperate that I just wanted a job, right? I didn't know what kind of job that was, right? And so I think having no internship experience, first of all, is just extremely difficult because whenever you go to LinkedIn or Indeed, they typically just have these requirements that are absurd, typically entry level candidates like myself coming from biology. Like I just I just wasn't qualified to apply, to any of these because they typically require, oh, you need to have like 2 years of experience. You need to have this kind of certificate and this and that. And so I think that just sort of instilled this mindset that I could never get a job like after I graduated from biology. And then I think also because after graduation, like I just, kept applying, kept hustling, and, ultimately I think luck played a role in landing this luck played a role in landing this luck just happened. And I think I received an email from this ed tech startup in downtown Toronto, and they were looking for a tutor. So at that time, I was like, let's just see where this takes me. Let's just apply and become a tutor. And then once I landed the role as a tutor, I noticed that this edtech startup just recently launched a video-based exam prep. So it wasn't even a tutoring business at that time. And I just kept volunteering to spearhead various initiatives and learn just enough to understand the ins and outs of the business and just the team and see how I can contribute and ultimately just pivot after, tutoring. So that was sort of my game plan. So get out of tutoring and see, where this startup takes me. And I noticed that they were really struggling to achieve product market fit, and I just think they were going after the wrong distribution. So I had my own hypothesis, because I came from a science background, like typically we would just formulate our own hypothesis, and I wanted to validate that. So I think my work ethic from being a biology student was carried over to my day-to-day in that edtech startup. So I did my own research, showed leadership the data that I've collected, which are the leads I've generated and converted into customers, into paying customers using various acquisition channels, and convince leadership to pour more resources into this area of the business, into this audience as a potential opportunity to expand the business, right? Not just, video exam prep, because I think the way I see it, it's just a very saturated market. And so that's how I started, like figuring out like where I wanted to go.
You are putting in practice what a lot of times folks are asking, if I'm planning to be a product manager and I don't have any product management experience, because getting product management experience is hard if you don't have any formal pathways to an internship. If you go to a school that is not necessarily very frequently attended by folks from the big tech companies, getting the first step is hard. And it seems like you found that key to figuring out how to apply product management knowledge from the very, very beginning. Were there any challenges with just getting started, just getting that first foot in the door in even the startup that you're describing?
When I was, volunteering to do various initiatives, like I had no idea what PM was. Like I knew what engineers are doing, what designers are doing. Like I'm aware that, these roles exist, but I didn't really look into product management because I went to a school where like there wasn't really a heavy tech influence. And so that was really hard. And when COVID happened, I actually reconnected with one of my cousins who's a software engineer. And I haven't connected with him for almost like 5 years, since I was just the type of person, back in university who would just study all day, lock myself in a library, never networked with anyone outside my industry. And during our call, I told him what I was up to. I launched this tutoring business for this startup. And I told him that I didn't really have a career direction after launching this tutoring business. I just didn't know what career title would fit what I was doing, because I was literally doing multiple things, such as, teaching, doing the sales calls, doing the marketing, growth, billing, sending the invoices, talking to customers. So it just didn't fit one career title. And I think it's just not enough to call myself a business development representative in that sense. And to my surprise, he said, "You're already doing some aspects of PM or product management. So why don't you become a product manager?" And I was so confused because I literally had no idea what product managers do. but he directed me to this book called Cracking the PM Interview. And then from then on, I just focus on interviewing for PM roles. So I think COVID was a blessing in disguise for me because I had the time to reflect on where I can invest my time on and ultimately think about PM as a potential career path.
It's an interesting perspective because what I often find is that folks get a little bit paralyzed in that aspect of even finding a network. Tell me more about that. How did you find that initial set of people that you can connect with to learn more and to kind of find those opportunities? Because again, just like we talked about just internships, building that from scratch is very, very hard when you don't have already a set of connections that can put you in touch with somebody that is a VC, or maybe they're a PM at another big company or anything like that.
He actually told me to go onto Twitter and then just take a look at his, following list and see what people are up to. Because the way I see it, well, first of all, I know like some people, they like to have this notion of, oh, I need to find mentors and where do I find them, right? But really, like the way I see it, you can actually passively learn from someone else. Like it doesn't have to be active learning all the time because people are busy, right? And so the way I saw that was I went onto Twitter, looked at, like started somewhere, like someone big, probably, Gary Tan. Like I'm a huge fan of Gary Tan. And I just looked at his following list and I would just, check out the tweets of these people, see the relevance and if it applies to my life or my career stage. Because the way I see it is there's so many resources on the internet, but they might not even apply to you at that right moment. And I think finding that relevant resource is just really about figuring out, okay, like going through someone else's following list, identifying, okay, this is an operator who works at this company and at this stage, and I feel like I can relate to that person, and I would just follow that person, and that's sort of just my my Twitter algorithm per se, or like how my newsfeed looks like. And then initially, I would actually go onto LinkedIn. And I think everyone does this. Like if you're an aspiring PM or like aspiring engineer or designer, you would typically go onto LinkedIn, look at, for example, Microsoft, and then just look at their title. So like program manager at Microsoft. And I would just bombard these people with, connection requests with personalized invites, right? And I think it worked to some point, but I just came to realize if you're sending a generic message, say, hi, Dan, I noticed that you're a PM at Microsoft, and I'd love to learn more about your journey. That's not gonna cut it, right? Like if I see that message, I'm like, okay, like you can learn from other PMs, like why me, right? And so the way I approached this problem was I would reach out to folks that I truly resonate with, and I'm just going to give a shout out to folks who actually helped me in my journey. So Will Najjar was one of the PMs that I reached out to because surprisingly, his LinkedIn profile, I saw like he studied biology, spent time on research, which is exactly what I did and where I wanted to be. And he's now, a PM, like a highly successful PM. And so I sent an invite. I told him that, I'm in the similar situation where I studied biology, didn't exactly knew what I was going to do like after college. And then, miraculously, I guess he saw my message and he decided to respond because if you think about these operators, right, they get probably hundreds of messages on their LinkedIn inbox, right? So I think you need to have a compelling message to really stand out as to why this person should invest their time on you, right? Because I'm talking about like these are product leaders who don't have time, right? And their time is extremely valuable. Like why would they set aside some time to talk to you? Like pretty much like a nobody, right? So I think that's sort of how I approach this this reaching out on LinkedIn. And then another person I reached out to was Calvin Chan, right? So I was part of this Product Buds community. It's like a Slack group where you just come in and then you just meet aspiring PMs and then you just, talk about, what's going on, what are some resources you can like share. And I reached out to this person on on Product Buzz because I did saw that he was promoting his newsletters. So I read his newsletter. So his newsletters talks about the software development cycle, how you should set up your A/B test, how you should prioritize, things like that. So it's really specific to being a product manager. And then I reached out to him on LinkedIn. I told him, I actually read your newsletters and here's my feedback. And then I specifically asked him, like, hi, Calvin, how would you typically set up your A/B test? How would you run it for? Sorry, how long would you run it for? And, what sort of, I guess, requirements do you typically need to set up an A/B test, right? So my questions were extremely specific to the point that he can only, like, Calvin is the only person who can answer my questions. So I think that's really important, making sure that when you ask a question, it has to be, I guess, second level questions, not generic ones, because otherwise, you can just search, your questions, or you can just Google your questions and you can get an answer like elsewhere, right? So I think those were some of the things that I did. And also, a lot of the times, you can actually learn from your peers. Like, you don't necessarily have to find a person who's older than you just to learn about PM, because sometimes, like, your friends can tell you things, you don't know. And I think that's why I love talking to people outside of my circle of competence, because it just reminds me of how much of the world I still don't know.
I like that approach. And there's so many things that as you were talking, I was just nodding along. And this is like, yes, 100% that. There's the other side of this where you're very intentional about both crafting your Twitter strategy, because you mentioned that you reached out to people that actually resonated with what you're trying to do, which is very, very important. So you did not follow the typical, I'll just follow everyone that has product manager in a title and see what they have to say, instead of just, okay, there's a set of people that I actually deeply care about learning from. And the second one, or the third one in this context, is when you went to LinkedIn, you actually tailored the messages to their experience, what they did. And what kind of stood out to me is that the mistake that a lot of beginning PMs do is when they reach out to people outside their immediate network, the first thing they ask is, can you be my mentor? And that's a scary proposition. If you tell somebody, like, can you be my mentor right away? It's like, I don't know you. I don't know what you're doing. And being a mentor is a commitment, because now you have to hold their hand. You have to making sure that you check in with them and help them, versus like what you did is you asked some very concrete questions of saying, okay, I have this problem. I'm curious what your take on that is. Much more different. It seems like it.
Well, I just want to let you know, to all the people that I've reached out to on LinkedIn, Twitter, I never consider them as mentors, because it's just weird calling someone a mentor. It's like they're obligated to, like, dedicate their life to help you, right? So I just think, we should normalize friendships over mentorship. That's the way I see it. But yes, I'm just really grateful that, some of the people that I've reached out to actually wanted to talk to me, because that's really hard, right? It's like, you've never met this, like, this is a complete stranger who actually reached out to you, right? So why would you, help this person? Like, I'm actually very successful. For Calvin Chan or Will Najjar's case, I would say they're extremely successful in their, product careers. Like, why would they talk to someone like me, right? Like, I have nothing on my resume. Like, all I did was start an online tutoring business, and that was it. Like, I don't have, a FANG on my resume. Like, there's nothing in it for them, right? And so, to be honest, I think the way I approached this was just reach out to people you want to make friends with, because I think friendships are just more genuine, and, it pays greater dividends down the line, especially, when you, let's say, you're in this stage in your career where you just have so many questions, but no one can really answer those questions. But at the same time, it should be a give and take relationship, right? Like, for example, for Calvin, the way I saw it was I consume a lot of his newsletters, but at the same time, I provided feedback so that he can, iterate his, we're going to squeeze in some like PM terminologies here. So we're going to iterate his, newsletters, because otherwise, what's in it for him, right? Like, why should he talk to me? So I think it's just those little things that I think will make you stand out, right? It's just nice being a human being, right? Outside of, tech or your career.
I was counting the minutes until we say the word synergy, and then it's gonna be like a PM bingo. So this is we won the whole thing. But I like the approach of, again, tailoring the messaging, making sure that you're reaching out to people that you actually care about learning from. And the other piece that you just called out is that you actually have to assess what's in it for them. It's not just the fact that you need to pay them or anything, but just more of, if they engage with you, what do they get in return? And a lot of people see this relationship as a one-way thing where you can take, give me advice, give me advice, give me advice, instead of let me help you, whether it's feedback on a newsletter, feedback on a product, or can I sign up and test whatever you're building and making sure that I'm giving you consistent, input on what you're doing. And that stuff is hard. And I'm curious, did it get easier with time? So probably when you first started reaching out to people to the time when you were comfortable just kind of pinging people and saying, hey, by the way, I'm doing this, did it get easier with time, or did that really not change?
To be honest, I think it gets easier with time, just because when you're like, I think getting started is the hardest part. It's always the hardest part, right? Like figuring out like where you should start, how you should start. So I think getting started was just difficult. And so I think as you reach out to people, you would start noticing that there are some people who just doesn't want to talk to you, right? Nothing personal because they might be busy or things like that. So I think you just have to, it's a numbers game, right? It's like, it also depends, I would say, on luck, whether that person would actually see your message, at that moment in time, and if they want to respond to you. So I would say just keep trying. Obviously, you're not going to be able to please everyone or talk to everyone. But I think it's really important to, get to know the person and see whether you're able to make that connection with that person, as friends. And then ultimately, you would know whether you vibe with that person or not. And I think, to be successful in your career, it's figuring out who are the people that you look up to because you resonate with their story or because they've achieved what you've always wanted to achieve, right? So I think that's how I approach this whole game of networking. And yeah, it's okay not to be responded. It's okay, not to not get seen on LinkedIn because, these people are very busy, right? So I think early in my career, just reach out as much as you can, because if you didn't reach out to begin with, you're never going to get an answer, right? If you get a no, then, at least you tried.
I think that's the part that you're getting to where a lot of folks are afraid of that first no. Rejection is hard. When you get rejected for either a job interview or an internship or a connection, it feels like, oh my gosh, this person hates me. They don't. They really don't. They just, stars did not align. And like I said, luck plays a big role in that. And when they saw your message, how busy they were that part of the year, or like so many factors that you just can't account for. But with all the things that you've done, again, you crunch so many things in such a short time, and it's super impressive. Do you think your science background helped you in any capacity in kind of ramp up quicker than you would have without it?
Yeah, I would say so because, biology is part of STEM, engineering is part of STEM, but obviously engineering is so much harder. And the way I see it is science people like myself are very analytical, right? So I think it's about being able to pick up or identify the gaps that I'm lacking. For example, like design. I had no idea how to use Figma, like when I was starting out. I don't even know how to build my own portfolio. Like, for example, purchasing a domain, setting up, my first GitHub repo. So I think those were some of the things that I just didn't know how to do. But I think because I came from, I guess, a very competitive environment where everyone just wants to get into med school, get like a really good MCAT score. So I think that competitive environment set me up for success, or has instilled that hustle culture. Like you have to be better at this, you have to be better at that. So I think that that sort of mindset, that growth mindset, I was able to carry that into what I'm doing today. But I think, typically, when you say PMs, like early career PMs, like, how like some people, they would just say, oh, PMs don't need to be technical, right? Contrary to popular belief, I actually refuse to believe in that, because, if I don't have a target school on my resume, right? What is the compelling evidence as to why recruiters would want to hire me, right? I came from a biology background. That, like, that in itself, like, I'm not able to translate that into my work, right? Like, into PM, right? Because as a PM, you need to understand, design and engineering, which are two things that I don't really have, right? So I think focusing on the trifecta, which is design, engineering, and then business, is really key because that forms the core product team. So I think those were some of the skills that I had to learn as I was on the job, and even just reading so many newsletters, so many articles on the weekends. So those were some of the things that I had to close the gap.
The concept of being technical is heavily debated in our industry all the time because there's this debate of technical, non-technical, is it good? And I find your approach to be the most viable in a lot of the situations because what I like to see them as career moats. What differentiates you from somebody that is just like you, that's applying for the exact same job that they might not have? And a technical skill usually is the one that is, I don't want to say it's easy to acquire because it still requires a lot of work, but it's something that is more accessible. You can develop technical skills without going to college. You can develop technical skills without taking any formal courses. You can just start watching YouTube videos. You can start coding. You can come up with a project. You can build a website. And this is something that when I chatted with Dan Olson, who runs, he's a consultant in the product management space, and he was talking about the exact same thing. When you talk to PMs and they apply for a job for, say, some startup that builds web applications, and you say, okay, cool, show me your website. And they're like, I don't have one. Well, not inherently bad, right? You might not have a website, but guess what? There's a lot
of red flag.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people that will have that website that you don't have, that they actually put the effort. And then you're like, all right, you're trying to work at a startup that builds web applications, but you don't have an understanding of web applications, right?
Right.
Like, yeah, you can learn, but, and something that actually stood out to me in the tweet where you were discussing, you had this thread where you were talking about your journey. You mentioned that you landed your current role and you work at Microsoft, so work at the same company, which is awesome. But you landed your role based on competence and not credentials. Tell me more what that means to you.
Yeah, totally. So what I mean by competence, not credentials, was because I don't have a CS, degree, first of all, because most of the people that are, within the product team typically have a CS background or human computer interaction, which is something that I don't have. I didn't go to Waterloo. It's a known Canadian school where that's like people there just breathe and live like tech culture, right? So by any means, I'm not calling out folks who actually went to these schools, to Stanford, to Ivy Leagues, but that thread was just meant to inspire people who are in a similar boat, because everyone may start in a different place in life, but it's just a matter of how you respond to your circumstances to get to where you want to be. I mean, it's not easy, but it's possible. And I hope to serve as a living proof that it is possible to get into PM. And I think it's all about grit, right? So she's a partner at Sequoia Capital. She actually talked about this concept of grit where it's distance traveled. And this is sort of like a metric in terms of so this is sort of like a metric where you measure where you come from to how far you've gotten. And I think, like, for me, for someone who has none of this privilege, right, I think it's a great metric to see how far I've gotten and things that I've achieved, right, over, in a year or a year and a half. So I think that's how I see competence, right? Because I think even if you have the credentials, right, if you don't hustle when you get the job, I don't think you're going to succeed anyway, right? Like, I think if you have credentials, leverage that, right? Because, you start in an easier place in life. But for someone like me, where, I don't have the opportunities laid out for me. So I think I just wanted to show people that you can start anywhere. And as long as you hustle your way to get to where you want to be, like, it's definitely possible. It's just harder, and it takes a longer period of time to actually get there, depending on how you hustle, right?
Right. And this is such an important point to make, is that a lot of people don't realize that even having a credential can be a huge, huge bump in that kind of privilege, right? Where you can like, oh, you have a degree at Stanford. But that alone, for a lot of people, is biasing them towards saying, oh, this must be a super talented person because he came from Stanford. And they don't look at the fact that, you can have just as talented folks coming from all sorts of state schools, community colleges, or people without a formal education that are really, really good. But we're putting such a huge emphasis on the degree that it becomes much, much harder to stand out when kind of you don't have it. And I hope that this is changing. And I hope that, again, what you said is so accurate, and that you are the living proof of the fact that you can actually go without one of these Ivy League schools and still be successful and still build great things. And to the point of, you mentioned that when you first started out, you were non-technical. And what skills did you focus on first? And how did you go about developing them to be where you are today? Like, what helped you along the way?
Right. So when I first learned about product management, I heard this term called trifecta. Basically, it's PM, design, and then engineering, right? So the way I saw it was, okay, if I'm going to be working with designers and engineers, now I have to understand what they're going through, because that's just empathy. That's how you build stronger relationships with your engineers and designers, because you understand what they're going through. Like, you actually know how to perform the cost analysis, you understand the limitations, the timelines better, and you just have their respect, right? So you're also better at, for example, listing all the spec requirements. And this is really crucial for the success of your product, right? So in general, I think you just avoid falling through the cracks. So I focus on building my, business skills by consuming like VC and operator content on Twitter and pretty much like everywhere. Even on TikTok, by the way, I just want to point out that Justin Khan makes amazing TikToks. If you're like, if you have a short attention span like myself, I would spend hours just like scrolling through his like feed. And yeah, I focus on design and engineering as well. So every company that I applied to, I tailored my resume to a product each company is known for. So say, for example, I applied to Google. I designed my resume in a way that it looked like the Google search engine. And then for Lyft, I believe it was the mobile app where, you call like your Lyft driver. And then what else? I think for Microsoft, I could have done better. I could have designed a Teams resume, but it just wasn't sustainable. You know what I mean? But, it got my foot in the door. That was my competitive mode. That's how I stood out amongst like all these candidates who have like, CS backgrounds, design backgrounds. And because I had a biology background, right, this is something that no one else has. Well, I'm talking about like just, I guess, as a sample size, right? If you think about all these applicants, like thousands of applicants like applying in this portal, I have a biology background, but I'm also technical, right? So that's two steps ahead of like these, CS folks, right? I mean, I'm not, what do you call this? I'm not saying, this is an advantage, but the way I see it is most people don't really recognize their disadvantages as advantages. So I think you just have to know your gaps and make sure you identify those gaps by being better at, for example, design and engineering, because that's something that I didn't really develop when I was in university. And some companies also assign take home. So for example, there's this, I think it's like a Singaporean based company. It's called Shopee. It's C Limited. It's very prominent in Southeast Asia. e-commerce company. And during my screening process, I designed, my take homes using Figma, right? Because I think even if you don't get an offer from that company, the fact that you made it through the interview rounds, right? The fact that you put in the work to design, a deck for this company, it just honed your design skills. Like that's still part of the learning process. And I think when I did my Microsoft interview, because I had to do an interview with not only PMs, with like my manager, my skip manager, but I also had to do an interview with, my design manager, right? So that's another thing that I have to deal with that most APM and RPM programs don't even have to go through because it's all like PMs basically. So during that interview, I talked about some features they've launched, identified, potential opportunities, and I used Figma. So I literally shared my screen to my design manager and my skip manager, shared my screen, used Figma. So I talked about breakout rooms. So breakout rooms, by the way, is on Teams. Talked about breakout rooms and some potential opportunities for expansion. And then I literally used Figma to wireframe in front of them. So I wanted to sort of paint this picture that like, hey, you got to hire me because I'm actually bringing something to the table. And, not only bringing like new features to this company, but making sure that, okay, like I'm able to identify this TAM, or total addressable market. Because at the same time, when you launch features, right, as a PM, you have to take note of, okay, how much money are you bringing into the company, right? Because it's not just, engagement or let's say retention, but also I think it's bringing revenue to the company, even as large as Microsoft, right? So that's why I love product, because you're focused on not just the product itself, but also the distribution, the marketing, the sales, bringing in revenue for the company, and so on and so forth, right? Even dealing with small things like compliance, security, now that I'm at Microsoft. So another thing that I would advise early career or aspiring PMs to do is build your portfolio from scratch. So don't use, what do you call this? So try to build your portfolio from scratch, because I think when I got into Microsoft, that was the only time I designed my my website. It was too late. To be honest, like I could have done that from the beginning. I could have designed my portfolio from scratch and showed that to recruiters and potential hiring managers. And instead of watching those videos where they tell you, okay, here's JavaScript 101, things you need to watch, basically. I think it's important for you to pick a problem. So just pick a problem, whether that would be related to education, and just build the product for it and just have a checklist. Because as you go through the whole like user journey of building that product, it's actually so much better when you're applying things. Because I think in tech, when it comes to, I guess engineers can relate to this, because the way like I learned how to design or how to, build my portfolio is actually going through, okay, like how do I purchase my first domain, right? So this is what you should do. You should go to this website. Like I had to do it in order for me to learn it. So I think that's something that I highly recommend. Just learn by doing. And if you don't know what you're doing, just look up Stack Overflow. Like you're gonna get like so many answers from like just Googling stuff, right? You don't necessarily have to watch an hour video and then basically after that whole like hour, everything just goes away. So I think you just have to learn by doing.
I think this podcast becomes like overflowing with good advice to the point where I'm going to be bookmarking this podcast episode, because so many important points, and one of them that you just called out is learn by doing. And goes contrary to what I hear a lot from PMs. They're like, oh, I looked at Twitter, I watch YouTube videos, it's great, I know what total addressable market is. Like, yeah, but did you build something where you had to think about that concept and how to get the total addressable market? And like applying those things is hard. And as with everything else around product management, engineering, is you start encountering those challenges along the way that you did not expect. And not everything has a recipe for it. Not everything has a blog post covering it. And you won't know that unless you actually try it. And I find it a little challenging too when I try to explain to people, well, how do you learn product management? You have to
You
do
just
it.
do it.
You just do it, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, you can't like I don't know, like can point you to a YouTube video and say like, well, just watch this video of Justin Can talking about how he built Atrium, and then you'll know exactly how to start a company. No, you don't. You looking back at my own career when I first started as a PM, I knew nothing. And if somebody told me, it's like, well, how did you become like better at it? Like, I don't know. I worked at this for a couple of years, and that's how it became better. But it's practice. But something that stood out to me in what you mentioned is you need to develop empathy for people that you work with. So designers, engineers. How do you develop that empathy? What helps you?
As I mentioned, I built my portfolio from scratch because I think I wanted to learn, front end, back end, and ultimately, I know this is a little bit ambitious, but I'd like to be, I'd also want to be recognized as, I guess, an engineer in the future because, product is all about mastering the trifecta. So I think setting up my portfolio, figuring out, okay, how do I set this up on GitHub, right? How do I make sure that all, the images, how is it responsive to not only web, but also mobile, right? Because that's really important whenever you're thinking about the end-to-end experience. So I had to make sure that that was working for my portfolio. Like, for example, light mode to dark mode, for instance, right? Is it even working? So yeah, I basically just went through. So I designed my portfolio using Figma. That's the first step, right? That's how any PMs would start typically. Like you talk to designers, you lay out your requirements, and then you build something on Figma. So that's what I did. I built something.
You're giving so much credit to a lot of PMs right now. I don't know. I don't know how many PMs are that willing to do that.
Right. So yeah, so you would lay out all your requirements. So like I want to have like dark mode, like fancy stuff, right? And then you talk to your designers, right? So I use Figma to build my portfolio, and then once I'm happy with it, right, I figured out, okay, like now I need to set up my portfolio, make sure I have a domain, make sure everything's like, make sure everything's I can view it basically, because otherwise, if you can't view your product or you can't interact with your product, it's pretty much garbage, right? So yeah, figuring out how to use GitHub because my GitHub is kind of embarrassing. Like I could have done more work to it, and I will. So yeah, figuring that out, making sure. So I use Netlify. I think it's called Netlify, from what I remember, to make sure that the host is working and all that stuff. And to ultimately, sharing the product, right? Because if you think about why are you building a portfolio, right? It's a product, pretty much. Like the way I see it, it's a product. Well, obviously not being used by a lot of people, but it's my own product. And I think my problem was, how can people see what I've done in the past, right? So that's what I'm trying to solve here, right? It's a product. So now that I have this product, now everyone will know, okay, like this is what she's done in the past, and this is the result of all the things that she's gone through, right? So that's the way I see what a portfolio does. I mean, there's so many like no code like portfolio, but I think if you go through like the step by step of like having, index.html, I believe that's what it's called, and all that, style.css, going through like Visual Studio Code, like you would understand what engineers are going through, because let me tell you, it's hard. Like it's a grind. Like figuring out, like earlier when I was starting in my career, like I had no idea what PM was and, what typically engineers do. Like all I knew was they code. That was it. But no, like they actually go through so many processes. Like they have to figure out, okay, like how many days will it take for us to build this product, right? Especially when the code is so intertwined, so complex. It's not like they can just, squeeze a bunch of code in and, that's done, right? That's not how engineering works. So I think being able to relate to your designers and engineers, it just gives you plus points, right? Like people would just respect you as a PM, and it's sort of like this negotiation game where, for example, if you if you approach your engineering manager, why should we prioritize your work over someone else, right? So it's little things like that, I think, gains you the credibility as a PM, which, oftentimes a lot of PMs just typically overlook, especially when you're early in your career. Because you can't just order, your engineers and your designers to like, hey, you got to build this, right? That's just not how the workplace operates.
Well, and not just that, but once you actually understand what's going on behind the scenes, it becomes much easier to have those conversations with engineer or designers when they give you an estimate that says it's got to be 6 months. You're like, really?
Right.
Here's why I don't think it's going to actually take 6 months, because if we scope this and there's this other thing here, and that helps you kind of understand the end-to-end cycle of, I want to say, the software development life cycle. That's the best way to put it. And the respect of your peers is also very, very important, because the reality is when you work with designers, you work with engineers, data scientists, they all want to talk to somebody that understands their problems. They understand, here's the challenge that I have right now with building this dashboard, and here's why I can't do it as quickly, versus telling somebody and like, let me explain to you what this is about from zero. I know you don't know anything about this, but just get this. It's taken a while. So respect of peers, it's also very, very hard to earn. But I want to zero in on the portfolio for PMs. And this is something interesting, because when you talk to PMs, or I want to say when you talk to, say, a designer, the portfolio, they show you a bunch of mock-ups that they did. They show you a bunch of, I redesigned the label for the cereal box or something like that. And I know this is oversimplifying it. They do way more than that. But then you talk to engineers, they can point you to the GitHub profile and say, look at all the open source projects that I've built and all these tools and libraries and utilities. What's a portfolio for a PM? Because especially when you have not yet worked at a big company, you have not shipped big products, what is that?
Right. So first of all, I can only speak for early career PMs, PMs that are in a similar boat. Because I think the way I see it is if you're like 10 years in your career, you wouldn't really need a portfolio. So I think when you're starting out, especially when you're an aspiring PM, what I mean by a portfolio is, what are some of the designs you've worked on, right? Because at that time, I wanted to sort of prove to hiring managers or recruiters that, like, hey, like, I understand design and engineering, right? So the way I built my portfolio was, here are some of the designs I've worked on. So let's say if I get a take home from Lyft or Redfin, I would design a slide deck. So people would tend to, use PDFs or like Word docs to just type up, their competitive analysis or whatever they think about the product, right? So I did an extra step where I use Figma to communicate my ideas, my thoughts, and basically just like answer the take-home assignment in a Figma file, right? And because you share that Figma file to the hiring managers or the recruiters, they actually know that you have some sort of design acumen. Like, obviously, it's not going to be comparable to what a full-fledged designer would be doing, but you understand design to an extent. And I think, as a PM, because you're not designing, on a day-to-day basis, but you understand what designers are going through by showcasing, okay, like, actually use Figma to design my slide decks. And this is how I show that I have some design acumen as a PM. Because I think the way I see it as a PM, like, I don't want to say you're a jack of all trades and a master of nothing, but that's pretty much like, you need to be skilled at multiple areas. Like, you need to be skilled in design, in engineering, in policy, for instance, legal. And I think it's a little bit of everything as a PM. But I think that's how you show that this is the work that you've done. And let's say, you've built more products when you're starting out. So let's say you have like a software engineer background. So what are some of the products that you've actually built, right? So I think just having like a link, or not even a link, but let's say a prototype in your website, that just goes to show that you actually know engineering.
You're spot on. And I do like the idea with jack of all trades, because it is so true. Like, no matter how you want to call it, but it is true. Because thinking back through anyone's career, when you're a product manager, you'll have to do a lot of things, and you'll have to step up for things that you might not have expected to step up. I'll give you an example. When I was working as a product manager on the docs.microsoft.com team, one of the things that we found out at one point was that we need to build this tooling for some documentation generation, and our engineering team was booked. They had no bandwidth. And I, as a PM, was like, you know what? I'll code it, whatever. Right? And it's like that's a superpower that a lot of people have. And you have that superpower too, where you bring that technical side, you bring that scientific side of saying, you know what? You actually did not put together the hypothesis the way it should be, because here's why, and here's how you set up this experiment better. And it's the little things that accumulate, and then you realize that your career mode is actually all these little things that have accumulated over the years that a lot of people think like, oh, that's not important. It is. It is very important. But to your career, and you were just starting out, but it seems like you did a lot, quite a bit, before you came to Microsoft. And one of the things that you called out again in your tweet thread was that you actually went through a lot of rejection during the time when applying for jobs. How did you handle that, and how did you not let that discourage you and moving forward and just kind of pushing through anyway?
For the longest time, I was ashamed to admit that I'm freaking obsessed with hustle culture, because I think I'll get canceled, right? Whenever someone comes up to me and say, "Why do you work on the weekends? You should take a break. Like, you're still so young, you still have a long way ahead of you." No, like, the law of compounding interest applies to more than money. Like, you have to start now. Successful people start planting their seeds in their 20s. So I think that hustle mindset of, wanting to be successful is just ingrained in me. But other than that, I think rejections, now that I've been rejected by so many companies, I think that's part of the learning experience, because let's say I interviewed for the Facebook RPM program, right? I got rejected, right? I sit down and then I take a time to reflect on what I've said during the interview. And I notice, sometimes I could have done better on these aspects, right? On these questions. And I think it's just really a strategy of how you want to sell yourself during an interview, and being able to reflect on, okay, I think I should have improved on this area, right? As opposed to what I've said. And then another thing is, I think it really depends on the types of candidates that they get during that cycle. Because I think, let's say for Lyft, right? So this is something that I've heard. They've only hired like a couple for their APM programs. I don't think they hired like 10 people. It's probably less than that. And I think even if you're technical, right? I think domain expertise, like if you have a background in, let's say, transportation, that sets you apart from, the applicants, right? So I think it's really about the types of candidates that they get to. It's not necessarily, because you suck at, interviewing, or you're just not a fit, basically, right? Like, there's just someone else who has all these, like, who's technical, who has a background in transportation that just fits with, that role. So I think you shouldn't pin yourself too much on, oh, like, I did so bad on the interview, because sometimes it's not necessarily within your, I guess, reach sometimes. Like, it's not within your control. There we go. So I think that's something that you need to just instill moving forward, because every interview that you've had is always going to be, okay, here are the types of questions that I'm expected to get in product management. And this is how I'm going to respond to these questions moving forward when I get, my next interview. And I think another tip that I received from one Yelp PM, one of my friends now actually, is to even apply to startups. Like, if you're dead set on just getting into FANG, just apply to startups, because every single interview, even if you don't get an offer, is still a learning experience. And I think a way to indicate whether you've succeeded is to get an offer from a startup, because startups are actually hard. Like, it's even harder to land an offer.
And what you called out earlier in the podcast too, and I think this applies here, is it's a numbers game. At the end of the day, you might lock in and your first application will get accepted and they'll fly through the interview and everything is going to be great. Or maybe it's going to be the 50th, right? When I had my interviewing stint, I went through, I think I want to say like 30, 35 applications.
Oh, wow.
And for like actual interviews. And I got one. Like, it's a numbers game. Like, you just don't know. And there's so many, like, I'm saying this a lot through this podcast, but you're so right with this point about there's factors out of your control. The interviewer might have had a headache that day and they were just not listening to what you were saying. And they're just like, I don't care about this. And it's bad that it is what it is, but it's totally out of your control. You can't, what are you going to do about it? You can't email them and convince them of saying, no, look, can I talk to you again? No. And the problem with interviews too is that after a lot of the interviews, and I think this for a lot of people that can be very discouraging, is you don't get any feedback.
Yes, 100%.
Right. So it's like, I just remember it was so frustrating to me too, when you're like, sorry, we unfortunately can't extend you an offer. And you're like, why? Can you tell me why, so I know what not to do in future conversations? But you don't know.
That's right.
And that amplifies it. How did you, by the way, deal with that part? Where if you don't get any feedback, how do you know what to fix?
Yeah, so first of all, if you get rejected by, the recruiters or the hiring managers, I think you should still take the time to thank them, because down the road, if there's a vacant slot in their team that's actually, that you actually fit in that role, if you built that relationship with the recruiter or the hiring manager, they're going to remember you. And they're probably going to be, you're probably going to be on their list in terms of, okay, like, I think Janine can actually work on this role, right? So it's a no for now, right? But it's a yes for later. So that's the way I see it. So make sure, you thank all your recruiters and hiring managers, because they actually invested time, right? Time is money, right? They invested time in interviewing you. So that means you're still a competitive candidate. It just so happened, as you mentioned, external factors, that's why you didn't get an offer from the company. So in terms of, I guess, feedback, it's just you have to keep going. So typically, I think the most generic messages I've received is, we've decided to move forward with another candidate. So I think as long as you take the time to self-reflect, think about all the questions you were asked, and think about all the responses you've said. I think it's just a matter of, maybe it's external factors, and you just have to keep on applying to the next gig. And, ultimately it's really luck coupled with hard work, to get to where you want to be, and ultimately, become a PM like I did.
And that takes also time. So don't get discouraged if, within the first month it happened that you did not get the position. It's okay. There's plenty of time. There's plenty of positions. And right now, thankfully, we're in a state where the market is open for a lot of folks. And there's a lot of opportunities for remote. There's a lot of opportunities for on-site, hopefully soon, once we all get vaccinated and everything else. But that said, I know that there's a lot of more stuff that I want to learn from you, but we're getting to the top of the hour. So I'll ask the pre-final question. Knowing everything that you know now, you've done extensive work to get where you are today. What would be your biggest advice that you realized through your journey, knowing, again, the steps that you took, that probably was not as obvious at the time, that you would say is important for folks early in their career to consider breaking into the product management space?
First of all, don't be a jerk. Don't reach out to someone only when you need something, because that kind of relationship is just not sustainable. Talk to people outside of your circle of competence, even if they're not in tech, because it's just going to remind you of how much of the world you still don't know. And that's sort of your starting step or stepping stone in terms of identifying, okay, this is something that I should work on. And if the door is closed, you try the window.
Door is closed, try the window. Just be careful about not breaking that window.
Yes.
So Janine, for folks that want to learn more about you, they want to follow your journey, where should they go online?
Yeah, so I'm at JA9CO everywhere.
So Twitter, you have what else?
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, Twitter, LinkedIn, all over the internet, even on TikTok. So I make comedy videos.
Okay, see now we're getting to the actual meat of the conversation. We were talking about your TikTok, but Janine, thank you so much for being here. Learn a lot from you, and I'm excited for all the things that you'll be building at Microsoft and outside Microsoft. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for this opportunity.